Ambassador Devere, my fellow panelists, distinguished audience, and my young student friends. I think I feel grateful to Dr. Bidda and the Symbiosis International University for inviting me for this conference in Pune. Pune strikes a familiar and a very emotional chord in me. My father, after completing his master's in 1920 in English, he joined the military accounts in Pune in 1921. And he spent 7 years until 1928. And I've heard so much about Pune from him that I really wanted to visit this city. So thank you, Symbiosis University, for inviting me to this conference. From yesterday, I've been hearing the proceedings of this conference, as well as the speeches and the presentations. And the two things struck me. One was geopolitics, and the other was geoeconomics. And most of the presenters tried to suggest that the geopolitics of the region permits India to play an important role, and Raja Mohan even talked about India emerging as a net security provider to the region. And the remaining papers were mostly talking about geoeconomics, that economic environment in the region brings the interests of these countries together, and there are possibilities of cooperation, both in terms of trade, investment, as well as development cooperation. I'll introduce a third level of analysis in international relations and in diplomacy, as well as in foreign policy. I would introduce the concept of geo-civilization or geo-philosophical in terms of understanding the nature of international relations and the interactions that can take place on those lines. Geopolitics and geoeconomics are undoubtedly important factors that brings commonness, bond, and common interests. But I think geopolitics and geoeconomics can also be contentious. The very term that was used yesterday, net security provider, can also bring in certain element of arrogance, as well as certain element of patronizing in that. And some smaller countries might even misunderstand that particular thing. And so is the problem of geoeconomics, that sometimes economic interests also clash, and that might also create conflict between countries. But in the case of geo-civilizational links or geo-philosophical links, that creates a kind of a common worldview, a common cultural pattern, and the way of thinking, there is not much scope for conflict in that. And in terms of promoting interests and in terms of developing closer relations between countries, I think that common worldview can give a better understanding of each other's interests and can create an atmosphere of conviviality that helps people to relate to each other. Now, my friend Suryanarayan mentioned in his speech about the fact that, Indonesia or Cambodia or certain other countries have representation of Hindu-Buddhist culture, which sometimes even we don't have in our country. I think that's a very relevant point, and one has to understand why is it so. Culture flew to these countries, interests and some of these things, either to the traders or priests or various other agencies that went into that region. There was a certain element of choice in terms of adoption of those values and sort of practices and the customs. And once when somebody accepts or adopts the principle of choice, he accommodates, adjusts to his local traditions and culture. Sometimes there is a problem in terms of these cultural things between countries. One of my Indonesian friends was talking to me the other day, and he said, when an Indian speaks, we always feel that we are also speaking. But at the same time, there is also a problem in that sometimes you may feel that you're all same, but there are differences, and the difference has to be understood, and the contribution and the kind of local genius in terms of adoption and acceptance of many of these cultures, one has to give proper sort of recognition to that. We talk about our culture going into Indian Ocean region, like in Mauritius, the diaspora and all that. But are the Mauritians the same as Indians? No, they have changed. Their language has changed, Creole, their habits have changed, but at the same time, the basic commonalities remain. So this recognition has to be there, because there could be a problem, even in terms of cultural interaction, if we don't recognize these differences and the subtleties in terms of the cultural expressions that everybody has adopted. Now that brings me to another question. Again, Suriname mentioned about what you call the syncretic culture. I think everywhere, wherever the culture had gone, it had adopted local traditions, with the result, even the face of Hinduism, Buddhism had changed to a certain extent in those areas. So is the character of Islam. For example, particularly in relation to Southeast Asia, and even in relation to some of the Indian Ocean countries, you see, particularly in the case of Hindu Buddhism, in the case of Southeast Asian countries, the character of Hinduism and Buddhism also underwent certain changes. In the Borobudur temple, which is a Buddhist stupa, in the inner sanctorium, there is the Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Now, how is it that in the Buddhist architecture, you have this Hindu trinity, which means there was a blending of culture and traditions, and they adapted things according to their own way. Similarly, Islam also, when it went to Southeast Asia, it adapted local traditions and cultures. And in the same way, it developed as a syncretic kind of a culture, and that actually made a great appeal to the local people to adapt even Islam. Islam in Southeast Asia didn't go through the invaders. It basically it went through the traders and cultural sort of kind of an acceptance of that. And that has happened essentially because of this syncretic character. Now, today, that syncretic culture is under threat. Everywhere you see people are trying to build up their own sort of identity. A new identity formation is taking place, maybe under the, under the sort of the pressure of globalization, under pressure of various other forces, global forces that has really been responsible for this kind of an identity formation. And this identity formation, what it is leading is a kind of a compartmentalization of each one's culture into their own. And that creates a tremendous sort of, a blockade to kind of harmonious relationship between various communities. Now, I think this is the kind of thing that we have to really understand. And not only understand, there is also a need for dialogue, what I call a civilizational dialogue between various cultures and various religions. Yesterday, Dr. Mojumdar mentioned about Bichar Manthan. I think there should be a dialogue Manthan also between various cultures and people, what actually they want, in what direction this society is moving. How does it really pose a threat to social harmony and all that? I think for that, there is a need for a kind of a civilizational dialogue between the countries of Indian Ocean region. And that can give a better platform for understanding each other and sharing each other. What does civilizational linkages mean? It only means that, there has been sharing of values and customs between people. And through that, they have been able to adapt a kind of a common worldview. Now, for that common worldview to continue, I think there is a need for a kind of a dialogue between the peoples of Indian Ocean region, and through this dialogue, they can create a mechanism through which they will be able to develop much better interaction between the people, and that brings me to the question of people-to-people contact. Now, whereas we talk about sometimes there's diaspora connections and all that, it's a one-way kind of a contact. I mean, there's not much that, the two-way, culture cannot flow in one way, it has to flow both ways. So there has to be people-to-people contact. I mean, it cannot be just on the intergovernmental level, it has to be on a more sort of a common people level. And that can take place only through educational cooperation. I think, what was the India's cultural influences people talk about? I think it's basically knowledge. Basically knowledge kind of sharing and knowledge dissemination. Now, knowledge dissemination can take place only if there is contact between people, between the younger elements in all these countries, and if there is educational cooperation. Whereas Government of India and many others adopt, like offering scholarships to students, I think that is not enough. I think there has to be certain mechanism in which the universities can exchange not only teachers, but also, exchange students. Now, teachers, at the early stages of ASEAN, there was a system which was supported by the Ford Foundation that an university teacher from one country, like for example, from Indonesia, could go to Philippines to teach, and a Filipino teacher could come to another country. So I think some kind of an exchange of teachers, professors, who could go to another country and teach can provide a different kind of a perspective. That will help them to develop a much better understanding. And I think even Ambassador Devery mentioned about sometimes lack of knowledge about people. I think this lack of knowledge can also be filled in by exchanging of particularly the teachers as well as the students. Now, many of the universities in India have a sort of system of what they call educational tour. And they normally tour within the countries, and it's kind of an educational entertainment kind of a tour. Now, why not devise a kind of a mechanism by which the younger students could visit some of the Indian Ocean region countries and spend their educational tour in those countries. And universities can always provide cheaper kind of accommodation and even, organize trips within those countries, organize meetings between the younger minds. And there could be better kind of seminars. Younger students can go to another country, have a kind of a seminar on certain common problems. That will give them a better perspective and reduce and remove many of the inhibitions as well as prejudices that we see when we talk about another country. So educational cooperation is another area which could be a part of this kind of civilizational interaction and that. And lastly, I will talk about tourism. Now, tourism, I just don't mean just tourism, going to another country and visit those places. What I'm talking about, which also Suryanarayan mentioned, about cultural tourism. Buddhists could come in terms of coming to Bodh Gaya, and this could be some kind of a spiritual kind of a tour. Similarly, I would say that even Muslims could sort of come to visit, like Indonesia. At one time, an Indonesian, when I was giving a talk at an Indonesian university, some students asked me, are there Muslims in India? So when I told them that India has the second largest Muslim population in the world, they were surprised. So I think even Indonesian students, Muslims could be invited, could come on a package tour, visit, Hyderabad, Ajmer, Mysore, and various other places where the Islamic heritage is very strong. And they can also experience the kind of Islamic sort of diversity that we have in this country. Similarly, Indians can go to some of those places like Cambodia, Angkor Wat and all that and see that even though they look like Indian, but they're not always Indian. There is a local genius involved in it. In fact, when Rabindranath Tagore went to Indonesia and was visiting Bali. He said, I see everywhere in India, but I cannot recognize India here. Thank you.